The mystery of Maria Ridulph, solved, reversed, then unsolved again. Smash that subscribe button before it disappears like the truth in this case, because once you hear what happened, you'll never look at justice the same way again. Snow blanketed the quiet town of Sycamore, Illinois, on the night of December 3, 1957. It was the kind of evening where the streets were empty, the sound of children's laughter echoing faintly as they played near the glow of a street light. Among them was 7-year-old Maria Ridulph, bundled in her coat, giggling with her best friend Kathy. In small towns like this, danger felt distant, until it wasn't. At around 6:30 p.m., a man appeared out of the shadows. He was polite, even friendly, introducing himself as Johnny. He asked if the girls wanted piggyback rides. Kathy remembered his slick hair, his warm smile, and the way he seemed oddly familiar. Maria jumped on his back, her laughter carrying through the frosty air. Minutes later, Kathy dashed home to grab mittens. When she returned, Maria and the man were gone. Forever. The town erupted into panic. Parents locked their doors, officers searched fields, barns, and alleys, and neighbors combed through the snow with flashlights. But all they found was silence. For months, search parties scoured Sycamore and beyond. It was as if Maria had vanished into the frozen night. The Ridulph family was shattered. Maria's mother, torn between grief and rage, demanded answers that never came. Police interrogated dozens of men, including a local young man named John Tessier, who lived nearby. He was 19, strong, and often remembered as brooding. But Tessier had an alibi. He was traveling for a military physical. His name was crossed off the list, and the investigation grew colder with each passing day. 9 months later, Maria's body was discovered in a wooded area miles away. She had been taken, killed, and left to the elements. The evidence was scarce, the trail frozen in time. The case that once consumed Sycamore faded into the list of America's oldest unsolved child abductions. Yet even decades later, the story refused to die. Every anniversary, Maria's photo, smiling with her neat bangs and innocent eyes, resurfaced in newspapers, a haunting reminder of justice denied. Parents in town whispered her name to their children as a warning. Don't talk to strangers. But the real twist wouldn't come until decades later, when a single voice would bring the case roaring back to life. Kathy, now a grown woman, never forgot the man from that snowy night. She insisted that Johnny was John Tessier, the very man police had once dismissed. Her testimony became the spark that reignited the investigation. Detectives, hungry to solve what was now America's oldest cold case, reopened the files in the late 2000s. They found Tessier, now calling himself Jack McCulloch, living in Washington state. He had aged, built a life, and tried to leave the past behind. But investigators claimed Kathy's unwavering identification and Tessier's troubled history tied him back to Maria's disappearance. In 2011, more than 50 years after Maria vanished, McCulloch was arrested and charged. The Ridulph family, after half a century of torment, finally felt a flicker of closure. A suspect had a name. A trial date was set. The town braced itself to relive the nightmare. But beneath the surface of this apparent victory lurked doubt, missing evidence, and shadows of uncertainty that would soon unravel everything. When the courtroom doors opened and testimony began, the case turned into something far more complicated than anyone expected. And that's when the first cracks in the story of justice began to show. The trial of Jack McCulloch began in 2012, more than 50 years after Maria Ridulph disappeared. The courtroom was packed with journalists, neighbors, and family members who had carried the weight of Maria's loss across generations. The prosecution painted McCulloch as a young man with a dark streak, obsessed with girls much younger than himself. They leaned heavily on the testimony of Kathy, Maria's childhood friend, who swore that the man who called himself Johnny that night was Jack. Her voice, steady and certain, brought the jury back to that snowy street in 1957. She remembered his face his demeanor, even the way he spoke. To her, there was no doubt. And in a case that had so little physical evidence, her memory became the foundation of the prosecution's case. The defense pushed back hard. They argued that Kathy's memory was unreliable after so many decades, that no physical evidence tied McCulloch to the crime, and that his alibi, the military physical, was never fully dismantled. But for the jury, the image of a grieving town, a little girl's body left in the woods, and a woman's lifelong certainty carried more weight than doubt. In September 2012, Jack McCulloch was found guilty of kidnapping and murdering Maria Rodolphe. The courtroom erupted. The Rodolphe family embraced, tears streaming down their faces. After 55 years, they finally felt the scales of justice had tipped in their favor. Maria's brother called it a miracle, the long-awaited answer to a prayer whispered in silence year after year. For a time it seemed settled. The case was hailed as a triumph of persistence, a symbol that no crime was too old to be solved. Headlines across America declared it the oldest cold case ever solved. Sycamore, once haunted by shame and whispers of failure, felt a small measure of redemption. But in the quiet aftermath of victory, cracks began to spread. McCulloch never stopped protesting his innocence. He claimed that the timeline didn't fit, that records would prove he was in Rockford, Illinois, at a military exam when Maria vanished. He wrote letters, filed appeals, and begged anyone who would listen to revisit the facts. Then came the first breakthrough, a faded set of records, overlooked for decades. Phone logs showed that Tessier, now McCulloch, had called his stepfather from a payphone in Rockford around the time Maria was abducted. The exam records, too, suggested he couldn't have been in Sycamore that evening. The defense team pressed further. They uncovered that McCulloch's mother, who had once implicated him while on her deathbed, had been under heavy doses of morphine when she made her statements. Her words, once seen as damning, were now clouded with doubt. Piece by piece, the narrative that had convicted him began to unravel. What was once celebrated as justice was now under review. In 2016, 4 years after the conviction, an Illinois appellate court threw out the verdict. They declared the evidence against McCulloch insufficient and unreliable. Jack McCulloch walked out of prison a free man. The same courthouse that once condemned him now cleared his name. Maria's case, once solved, was thrust back into the cold shadows of uncertainty. The Rodolphe family was shattered all over again. They had believed they finally had closure, only to watch it ripped away. To them, McCulloch was guilty, no matter what the court said. To investigators, the case now stood in limbo. And to the public, it became one of the most disturbing reversals in American true crime history. The story was no longer just about a kidnapped girl. It was about the fragility of memory, the cracks in justice, and how even a courtroom verdict could dissolve into smoke. But then came a final twist, one that would make the world question not just the Rodolphe case, but the very idea of truth itself. The release of Jack McCulloch sent shockwaves through Sycamore and beyond. For the Rodolphe family, it was as if Maria had been taken all over again. Her bro there spoke bitterly to the press, insisting the justice system had failed them twice. First by letting Maria's killer walk free in 1957, and then again in 2016, when the conviction collapsed. To the family, McCulloch was still guilty, no matter what the courts decided. But to the law, he was now a man officially cleared of the crime. Reporters swarmed the town, digging into decades of files, trying to piece together how a case once hailed as solved could crumble so completely. The more they uncovered, the more disturbing it became. Kathy, the childhood friend who had identified McCulloch as Johnny, remained unshaken in her testimony. Yet psychologists debated whether memory from childhood, especially under traumatic conditions, could be trusted after 50 years. At the same time, investigators were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth. The evidence had never been strong. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, no weapon. The case had been built almost entirely on testimony and fragments of circumstantial detail. The military records, once overlooked, now raised serious questions about whether McCulloch could have physically been in Sycamore at the time of Maria's abduction. The once heroic story of justice delayed, but not denied, was collapsing into a cautionary tale of wrongful conviction. The unsolved murder of Maria Ridulph was returned to the cold case files, but the damage was already done. In the eyes of many, the system had betrayed both Maria and McCulloch. One side had lost a beloved child, the other had lost decades of life to accusations and a prison cell. Justice, it seemed, had eluded them all. Yet the story refused to rest. Podcasters, documentarians, and amateur sleuths began dissecting every angle. Who else could have taken Maria that night? Were there suspects overlooked in the frenzy to convict McCulloch? Some pointed to other local men, long dead, whose names never made headlines. Others speculated the real killer could have been a drifter who passed through Sycamore and vanished before suspicion ever landed. Still, the image that lingered most was that of Maria herself. A smiling 7-year-old girl, gone in an instant, frozen forever in black and white photographs. For the people of Sycamore, the case was more than history. It was a reminder of innocence stolen and justice denied. For true crime followers, it stood as one of the most haunting examples of how certainty can be manufactured, undone, and left unresolved. To this day, the mystery of Maria Ridulph remains officially unsolved. The courts closed the chapter on Jack McCulloch, but they opened a deeper wound, one where truth and memory blur, and where closure may never come. They thought they had their answer. They thought the case was over. But in the end, the only certainty left is this. Somewhere, someone still knows what really happened on that snowy night in 1957. And if this story has kept you questioning everything, just wait, because the next one will leave you even more unsettled. Hit subscribe and don't look away.